Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading property experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle channel, and Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the 2014 and 2015 Property Investment Advisors of the Year.
All right, folks, you're on the Property Couch, where each week Ben and I bring you the insider's guide to property finance and money management. Hello, Ben.
G'day, mate. How are you?
Very good. Hey,
You're very close to the microphone there.
Mate, drop the mic. Hey, interesting studio for us. We're in the Qantas little meeting room here.
Little meeting room.
Very special guest today, Ben. But before I introduce our guest,
Yep.
Just want to remind the troops that we've got a webinar coming up.
We do.
And we're really passionate about this because the market's changed, and some people are wondering whether or not they should be investing now. Is now a good time?
Yep.
So we thought that this is we've tweaked it so that it fully takes into account investing in a changing market. But it just really shows people some of the sins that you're likely to make when you're building a portfolio.
Yeah, mate. I'm thrilled about this opportunity to, deadly sins, read through the lines, big mistakes. Wealth destroying mistakes. We want to share those with the viewers. I can't wait for next Thursday night.
So next Thursday, the 9th of August, 7:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time.
All those people in the West and around the world.
Well, we've got people around the world.
We do have people around the world.
And we'll encourage anyone to check in. But what I will say is one thing. There are limited opportunities, not because of us, Ben, because the software will chop you out. Mm-hmm. So two things.
We don't have the bandwidth, Bryce. We don't have the bandwidth.
Register if you're keen. Register and turn up early.
And Bryce, Saturday morning, you might catch us on Weekend Today.
You will.
Talking about a changing market and talking about some of the spots that we like.
Yeah, so for the Channel 9 viewers, somewhere between 8:30 and 9:30 we'll be on, so check it out. Hopefully we get an opportunity, Ben. It sounds like it that we can get on there regularly, which will be a bit of fun.
Which will be a bit of fun.
So, check it out.
Property Couch on Weekend Today.
Weekend Today. Two things, the webinar and the Today Show this weekend. But Ben, let's cut to our very special guest today. Paul Glossop, he's the founder and director of Pure Property Investment, and he's built a substantial property portfolio, Ben.
He has.
Focusing on the fundamentals of property investing. So I'm looking forward to chatting.
What those fundamentals are, I'd like to know.
Welcome, Paul.
Thanks for having me, gents.
It's a pleasure. Now, normally I go into, before I introduce the guest, I normally go into Mindset Minute, but I sprung it on you nice and early. I said, have you got a go-to? And you said, yes, you do.
And I said it was my sieve-like brain that would probably know that under pressure crack. It's funny, I was talking to my team about it yesterday, and it was one thing about a little bit of Gandhi, whereas there's 2 days in the year which typically are quite useless, rendered useless, and those days are tomorrow and they're yesterday, so make the most out of today.
Oh, I like it.
Something that
Mahatma Gandhi's close to my heart because obviously
you played the lead character.
I played the lead character. So
when was that?
Well, I was about 16 when the movie came out. Right?
Oh, you did well for your age.
I'm in the cinema and starring Ben Kingsley. I'm like, there's my name on the big screen. I'm like, what's going on? Anyway,
did it work with the ladies?
He changed his name for the record.
Right.
So he's not Ben Kingsley. He's someone else.
Brilliant.
So, but now he's Sir. He's been knighted.
Oh, there you
and
go.
He's very good at Schindler's
Let's be honest, Paul. If we could all change our name, we'd change it to Ben Kingsley, wouldn't we?
No, Gandhi.
You've shown your age there, though. To be honest with you.
That's true.
Yeah.
40. I keep saying to my wife, I'm 47. She goes, you're 46. I'm like, but yeah, not far off 47.
You are 47, aren't you?
No, I'm 46, I think. Yeah.
Check
August. Or no, is it 48? I have no idea. I do not keep record. 71, baby.
I just like to remind everyone you're much older than me, so that's it. But
August 71.
So good one, Paul. Thank you for that. Now, we wanted to get you on because you're one of the sharpest minds going around when it comes to property, and I think it comes from an overflow of what you're doing in your own personal life, and I think that's really important that you're an investor first, and then you're trying to help your clients as well as part of your business. So, before we sort of talk about what the day-to-day looks like for you, take us back to where the seed was planted, however long ago it was. What was it? Can you remember it? What triggered it? Take us back there.
Yeah, so for me personally, it was probably a lot more about really way back when, and And again, part of me sort of thinking about when and how and what pushed me on a journey to think property was an answer to creating long-term wealth and stability, etc., was a time in my life where I come from a single mother. So my parents split when I was 11 years old. And funnily enough, my mum was a nurse by trade, retrained after I finished high school to become a postnatal depression psychologist. Did a lot of graft. My mum is a champion in the sense that she understood everything about taking care of me. And then once I was taken care of, reinvested into herself, got a master's at the age of 50 type of thing where...
Wow,
good on her.
In that sense...
How's that for leadership?
Well, it's part of that is sort of understanding, well, take care of people who need to be taken care of when they need to be taken care of. But once that's done, you've done the job and justified that, reinvest in yourself. And she's done that amazingly. And she's most certainly my mentor. But in that light, it was also... I remember sitting around a table after my parents split when I was about 13. And my mum, at the time... still lives in the same house I grew up in out Liverpool in Sydney, which was a house they bought together early 80s for $35,000, increased exponentially through the early 90s and got to the point where it probably was worth about 220 grand. Parents split, half that property obviously goes to my father, value of it, she had to get that money extracted and essentially take a mortgage that was very little to a mortgage that was an awful lot for a single income mother.
Wow.
So we sat around the table and I was not part of the discussion, but it was effectively with a financial planner. I didn't know a financial planner from Adam at the time, what they did, what their role was, and to a degree I still don't really for a lot of them out there who exist and I don't think necessarily do a great job. But there is a lot of them who do a good job, and I think from my side of things the discussion really was, well, here's where you are, here's where you'll probably get to, and my mum's is on a defined benefit government role, which I still didn't know what that meant at the time, but as we sort of had a discussion about it, I sort of understood that there's a defined income that's going to come from that, there's a certain level of debt that she has, but she's secure because once she retires, she's going to have this income, and in my mind kind of clicked and thought, well, if I can get myself in a position which allows that, there's a couple of different ways that can do it. You can create your own education, which then leads into a job, which then effectively you become an employee and work for the man and put 45 years of hard graft in and end up with a great position. Or there's ways to extract equity, because at the point, the crossroads was, do we take some of this equity from this home because there'd been some growth mid-90s and then invest it into a property? But the discussion was saying, well, you can't really afford this risk. Single income, what happens if you lose your job, what happens if you get ill, etc. But for me, reflecting back 2 decades after that discussion, I think, you know what, if mum had some advice at that point in time, as much as she's doing quite well as a retired ex-government employee now, that would have been a really different outcome. And I reflect back on that a lot now in these days and think, wow, there's so many points in life that if I was sitting on the opposite side of the table to my mum at that point in time, I thought, there's probably ways you can do this whilst you can stay secure, not risk everything, but it's probably still better the outcome long term. And for me, that was a point in time where I thought, wow, there was this, more reflecting back now, but that was the point where I became interested. That was probably the point where I was like, I like property and I like what it can happen or how you can extract equity from an asset as it appreciates in value.
So for the benefit of the listeners, a defined benefit scheme, they were around many, many years ago. There's still some very, very small pockets now around, in sort of government jobs, but they are few and far between. And what happened when businesses worked out that they were going to be up for all of this money? They tried to convince a lot of their people to get out of them, right?
Yeah. Because
they were that good. Because effectively what they are is an annuity pension in most cases. So there are some sort of variations to a theme.
Yeah.
But if you do have a defined benefit as a listener, or your parents have a defined benefit, someone's trying to convince you to get out of them, whether it be the professional financial planner or whether it be usually it's the business or the super fund that has to pay it out, do not move.
No.
All right?
It's a goose that keeps laying a golden egg.
Well, and it's, as you were saying that, Paul, I was thinking, passive income's like a defined benefit. Like
that's right. That's the
exactly
game.
What it is.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
So, but that's important for people to know. So, and if you want to know more about a defined benefit, absolutely talk to an independent financial planner, because a good one who's a fee-for-service financial planner will tell you exactly how much you can put in, because there is a tipping point for some of them. So the devil's in the detail. So you might be salary sacrificing or delivering extra to get your maximum defined benefit, but anything after that is basically money for them as opposed to money for you. So it's always important that, you know, when things like this come up, that we pause, circle back to what's a defined benefit, because most of us aren't on those in our current super funds. We've got to raise it all, we've got to invest it wisely, and we're not guaranteed of any return at the end of that. So thank you for sharing that, Paul.
What advice would you give Mum now based on what you just said? So you're, you know, back 13 or 16. What would be the advice that you'd give her now, taking into account what was around at the time in terms of property investments? Really a common topic now, but back then, not so.
No, very much so. And I think really it came down to someone or anyone in that position at that point in time where you're at a crossroads where you have capacity, but it's a bit grey as far as how much you're risking versus how much you can probably achieve out of a certain period of time. And she probably had 20 years of her working life ahead of her at that time, which is enough, most certainly, to get something probably meaningful happening. But really the key with her at that time was understanding that the risk would have been if you weren't managing your cash flow. And it comes down to almost every single property that we look at, and similar to yourselves, if you can't afford to hold it in the event that you don't have an income, it's a very risky investment. You know, she had, yes, a defined benefit scheme, yes, she had insurances around superannuation, etc., that if she were to fall ill, things were taken care of, but it doesn't change the fact, income protection, etc. But for me, that comes down to then selecting an asset, because she probably had a finite amount of money that she could have extracted in equity to reinvest, and at that time she probably could have invested it in the Sydney market at around about, you know, call it $200,000, something that would have been pretty close to neutrally geared at the time as well, even on 6.5%, 7.5% rates that were floating around at the time. So I think if she had a way to understand, well, just understanding very, very simply, here's what it's going to cost, here's what it's going to cost to hold, here's what it's going to, your mitigation number that you should hold in there for 1%, be it repairs, maintenance, etc. Here's how much you're going to be left at the end of the day. Someone just putting that in front of her, and then understanding why that property over time is going to be a very, very sensible investment, could have changed her life exponentially. And as much as she's definitely not in a bad position, but there's small crossroads or sliding windows, sliding doors moments where I think that could have been a next level. And there's probably so many of your listeners who probably think, wow, 20 years ago, if I was in that position and I just made that one decision, be it Sydney, be it Melbourne, be it Brisbane, be it Perth at that time, there's so many different, I mean, this is it, it's not Sydney centric, it's every town centric.
We've interviewed Jan Summers, built a portfolio in Brisbane. We've interviewed Peter Kaluzos, he's built a whole portfolio in Adelaide. You know, I've got personal family friends in Perth, they built them totally in Perth, even though Perth suffered of late, they still have amassed substantial portfolio. So
absolutely.
I guess for you, in terms of, okay, so that sparked an interest in property or financial transformation would probably be a better term. Why was property the vehicle for that financial transformation for you over shares, or I know you're building a business, but in terms of the more popular routes that people take?
Yeah, I think for me, the initial love after that, funnily enough, sort of blended its way into architecture. And when I finished high school, I did absolutely nothing for the best part of 2 years. I surfed, I travelled, I lived overseas, and I did everything that you probably shouldn't do when well, it's probably everything you should do when you don't know what you should do. And that's what I did. I spent a lot of time, finding yourself. And I still feel like I haven't found myself during the time. And I like that because it keeps me yearning all the time. But when I came back, I spent 2 years studying architectural technology. My enjoyment was structure, was property in the sense of the actual physical and the aesthetics. And that's where it led from that. I always had this understanding and passion to a degree just to make money. That was the drive, because I said there was money to be made. How and why and how I could combine the two took me another 10 years to figure that out. But it really was the passion of architecture, combining it with the ability or ways to make money.
I reckon if we sample 100 people who have travelled in their early 20s, the appreciation of having the money to reinvigorate what the joy you got from the memories that you created in your early 20s is a big driver. Like, I'm the same. I mean, I grew up in a family where we're all in the airlines, and so we travelled extensively, and you get a real appreciation for wealth, but you also get a real appreciation for how lucky we are, but also poverty in its extremity, and for me that's absolutely a huge motivator to know that, when my time comes to live off the passive income, you won't be seeing me in a house very often.
No.
Like, I'll be out and about travelling. Did you feel that once you came back and you found something that was interesting to sort of provide that for you, is also supporting the motivation of obviously being like you were when you were, single son under your mum, single household income, and you battled through?
Yeah, it's funny because I reflect back on life when I was a son of a mum who was a single income earner, etc. And I never went without. When I reflect back, we didn't have anything, and except for my mum's dedication of just chucking everything at me, and that was everything I wanted, everything I needed, every resource I had. But I sort of reflect back and think, I truly fundamentally I know full well with 2 young kids myself now that for them to be happy, they don't need much at all. No. All they need is me.
An adventure.
And that's it, and a way to explore their mind. And for me, that's really what I want to provide them, but also what yearned me is that for me, money was not necessarily to get anything other than saying I want to be able to enable myself to go and recreate, to your point, Ben, is exactly that,
it's
recreate the memories. That's all I really am looking to recreate. I did a surf trip with some mates end of last year to Papua New Guinea, and we went on 2 flights out to an extra island that was literally in the middle of nowhere, and we were 1,000 k's from Hawaii, 1,000 k's from Sydney. We're literally
in heaven.
Yeah, exactly, in absolute heaven. We booked it again, and I think I'm going to be vetoed by the wife to be able to go this year, but we'll do it the year after this year. But it's there to that point of poverty. But you know what? There was not a single white person on that island where we were, and every single one of them had a smile. So did I, so did my 2 mates or 3 mates who were with me at the time, and I thought, geez, life is really, really simple.
Because it's not exponential. Having an enormous amount of money does not exponentially increase your happiness.
Absolutely not.
It's scientifically proven that it's experiences, it's memories that you create. Sure, obviously having the ability to charter a plane and pop out to an island, isn't something you can do on a single, minimum wage income. But the point being is that if anyone thinks that this is all about, the person with the most houses wins, it's just...
Well, think about a billionaire and just call a billionaire if you had access to one and say, can you take next week off? Most of them can't. So do they own their assets or the assets own them? Versus people, I remember when you're talking about experiences as a kid, I remember seeing... do you remember The Pursuit of Happiness? It was Will Smith played it.
Yeah.
And his son.
When they interviewed the actual characters, I think it was on Oprah, I saw it.
Yeah.
And they cut to the son. He was in his mid-30s when they cut to him. And they said, because remember how he was bouncing around. He goes, what did you think at the time? He just said, I thought my dad would just take me on one big adventure every night. So here we are as an adult projecting onto them that, oh my gosh, we're not giving them a stable life. And they're going, wow, how good is this? Where's the next part of the adventure? So keep it simple, I think's the key.
Yeah.
Hey, it's interesting, we get the privilege of getting to interview people and get a bird's eye view of their perspective, including yours. And one of the things you said earlier was about that 20 years ago, and that's a consistent thing when we've talked. The interesting thing when you interview someone who's been investing for 20 or more years, the consistent message is that exponential ride that they talk about, that you've got to hang in there long enough to do. And a lot of people don't get to hang in for 20 years, and so they don't get to experience that nirvana that comes from seeing that exponential growth. Because if you talk about Tom, he bought that stuff
2 or 3 cycles
in Western Newton, and many moons ago, Newtown, that's right, and it almost broke him. And now through the latest, part of the cycle in Sydney, he would be sitting pretty on that. So I'm sure you can relate.
There's so much of it, and I think the privilege and the thing that I love, I wouldn't say I'm an old guy, I'm 36, but I look at it and say, well, I've been investing for over a decade personally, and I've seen the fruits of my labour as far as an investor's concerned. But the beauty about sitting on the side of the desk that I do is I work with clients, and you guys no doubt similar as well, is that you work with clients who have been investing far longer than yourselves, and the ones who sit on the side of the desk, you're like, tell me about the days where everyone talked about the same days we're talking about now, where money was expensive, credit was hard to get, yields were terrible, it was very hard to justify how that property is going to be worth any more than what it is in the next 15 years. And these people held that asset. The key is always the fact that they held the asset. They knew they could hold the asset and they could afford to hold the asset. And the rest of it really is, as you said, the nirvana of the second, and then the adulation of all the recommendations. Everyone says that he's a genius because the 3rd cycle comes, or she's a genius because the 4th cycle comes. Jan Summers, classic example. These are the people who are trailblazers, but the common thread is they all still hold property.
Yep, hold the nerve, keep play the long game.
Yep.
So we find our way into architecture.
Yep.
And then how did the transition happen between that and doing what you do today?
I quickly found out, so my journey from architecture led me to changing careers, because truth be told, it's a funny story. I won't go into it because it's a bit of a long one. But
give us the summary version.
I'll give you the Clef Notes. Ultimately, I spent 2 years, last year of the final year of me putting together my main works for my architectural technology course was designing a 4-story office block, which was going to be submitted for markings, etc. Back then was on a CAD program, on a laptop, which doesn't have backup technology, no cloud software, etc. I was at a Broadway hotel at UTS, literally at a bar about 3 p.m. with 4 of my classmates sitting at a high bar table, drinking a beer, about to submit our works. I got up, laptop bag gone.
Oh, no.
No backup. And it got to the point where I really didn't enjoy the last 6 months of what I was doing. I looked at it and I really thought someone for about 30 minutes was playing a joke.
Yeah.
And I went up and I spoke to my lecturer and I said, I know it's a real pain, but there's nothing we can do here. And that was it. That was for me. I thought,
career.
That
was it. And it's a really funny story in the sense that what that led me to do was take another 6 months off.
Yeah. Go back to Papua New Guinea. 1,000 kilometres away.
I was literally, I spent 6 months travelling up and down the East Coast surfing with some buddies.
Yeah.
And again, that was kind of my default. And at that stage, I came back and my mum, a lot of my neighbours at the time always thought I was good with people and that I should be in the teaching trade. So I went back retrained as a teacher. Yeah. So I became a teacher, science, physical education, spent 3.5 years getting my degree there, qualified, and then went straight from there back to the UK. Spent another year in the year and a half, 2 years in the UK, met my now wife, quickly realised that I don't earn enough money as a teacher and it's an extremely hard job to do properly. And that I wasn't that person for it. Came back here and reapplied my skills and my degree to pharmaceuticals. So completely separate to that.
Yeah, you got all
and
points
came
of the
back.
compass.
And it was at that time where I had no money. The story goes is I came back from London. I was in line to come back from London back in mid-2000s after my 2 years there after getting a degree and realising when I arrived back in Australia I wasn't going to be a teacher anymore, didn't know what I was going to do. And someone was walking through the line of everyone about to check in and said, we're overbooked. We've got four opportunities for anyone to fly business class tomorrow and you can stay a night in the Hilton and we'll give you a $1,000 traveller check. Please, I've got nowhere to go. So I stayed in the Hilton for the first time in my life. I flew business class the next day. I had 400 quid in my bank when I left. I came back, went straight from the airport, straight to town, cashed in my $1,000 check, had that $1,000 and the 400 quid that was transferred to about 650 Australian dollars at the time. And
you were loaded.
That was me. I was absolutely flush.
So what were some of the jobs you did when you're travelling? Like, obviously you pulled a few beers in your day.
Definitely pulled some beers both in Australia and outside of Australia. I worked in summer camp in the US for a couple of different stints over there. Yeah. I worked at a bar at Indiana University for some time whilst I was dating an American lady at the time, or girl at the time. I spent a fair bit of time perusing through a lot of people's backyards, not nicking stuff, mowing lawns across the Midwest when I was working over there. Anything and anything. Everything and anything to get by. It was just a way for me, a means to just enjoying what I was doing. So as I landed and had that cash in the bank, that was when I had a contact. My dean of my university, when I graduated from teaching, basically said, Paul, you'd be extremely good in the pharmaceutical trade. And I kind of fobbed it off. Her husband was the head of sales of a big multinational back in Australia. I came here and I wrote her in and saying, hey, any chance of me getting that catch up again? She said, sure thing. Caught up a week later, about 6 rounds of interviews because it's a multinational later, and I had a job. And that took me about 2 months, and that was by a country mile the highest paying job that I had. And the rest allowed me, that was my enabler. So enabling me to borrow money. And that was borrow and save, and that was really where it all started for me. And then understanding now I actually have an ability to fundamentally understand how I can do this. So the rest was a long, drawn-out journey.
And who were your mentors in the earlier stages? I mean, what were you doing? Reading the magazines, the books? Was there anyone that come to mind in terms of the people that you respected? Yeah, it's funny. So there's quite a number of people who back in the day I was sort of following and understood. My uncle, who's since passed away, was someone who wasn't necessarily a property entrepreneur, but was someone who I respected a lot. He gave me a job when I was in high school, worked hard, bought property, a bit more old school where paid it off, then bought the next rather than leverage, but it was a way of doing it back then. But it sort of saw the fruits of the labour towards the back end. Not that allowed me to think about where and what to buy and what properties are investment grade properties versus just property in general, but that sort of opened my eyes to how people are doing this in general.
my cousin Phil Tarrant was someone who probably started his investment journey similar time that I did. And we sort of rebounded off each other a lot. And we were two people who were pretty motivated, 10, 15 years ago to say there's a way for us to get this a little bit more interactive than what we were. And then from there led to a few other contacts, be it accountants, be it brokers. My broker, who's still the same broker I started with, he's been in my enabler. He's a very, very good mate. He's one of the guys I went to Papua New Guinea with last year. So he's a guy who I've known outside of property, but also is someone who's invested in property both in the States, in Australia, other areas, and just people who get it. They're my kind of caliber where they don't take themselves too seriously. They know that property is a great meaningful tool to do certain things, but it doesn't define me as well. So that's probably the part that I wanted, not just mentors who could do things and understood how and have already done what I want to do, but we're also people who I wanted to emulate, to the point of calling up a billionaire and say, let's go for a surf trip and saying there's no chance in the world. I don't want to be that person. I never want to be that person. And I've got more money now than I've had in my life, but it doesn't really, to a degree, it's a little bit sad because I feel like I'm probably more restricted as a business owner now than what I was when I was that 22-year-old, bleach blonde hair guy who just was footloose, fancy free. So, I mean, there's a point in everyone's life where you transition and say, well, I've got kids' responsibility and my mission is to be a father for my kids. But it's also, I do have my goal to say that there's a time in life where it'll be the summer of Paul again.
The summer of Paul. I like that. Trademark that. That's great.
What is the finish line look like for you? What's the goal? What are you working towards?
Yeah, look, we've done our numbers. So my wife and I do our numbers. I probably do our numbers far more often than I need to, but it's really to try and understand. It's, come the end of tax time now, we've done my numbers again, and I think realistically for us, it's our house paid off, and it's also probably about, I'd say realistically for us to live lives we are, 120 grand a year. That hits my bank account every year. That's all. I mean, it's not exactly chump change, but it's not exorbitant. I mean, I have two very basic cars. I'm developing a house at the moment and a development which is going to include my home, which is actually going to enable us financially to do a lot more than what we could have. And I've used my skills to be able to probably manufacture this time frame or expedite the time frame a bit quicker than I otherwise would have. But for me, my number's not enormous. My number's far from enormous, but it's still a number that gets bandied around a fair bit. Is sort of 100k passive is what I want. And I know what it's taken for me to get pretty close to 100k passive, and it's not an easy journey.
No.
So I think people need to be very realistic.
Well, it's 2 million, isn't it? In terms of
unencumbered.
If you don't want to touch the capital base, it's 2 mil.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what number of properties it is or whatever like that. It's 2 mil. It's
2
a rule
mil.
of 25.
2.5.
Yeah. So 2.5. Sorry.
Yeah. Take your 25 of 25 with 5% of just
Yeah.
expenses, etc., and then the rest is your gravy. Yeah.
So you touched on your skills before, and if anyone who follows you knows that that you're interested in turning apples into apple pie in terms of adding value to property. So we sort of skipped from architecture to getting involved, but how did you get involved in the buyer's agency space? And then was it always development early, or did you sort of get a run up to that?
Yeah. Most certainly not. And for me, it was always initially, how can I buy and hold? That was all I considered, was what is going to be a good quality property that over time is going to increase in value, and how can I make sure that I can hold this property and it's not going to affect me getting that finance to buy the next property, and so on and so forth. Now, it wasn't buying the cheapest property with the highest yield in anywhere I possibly could around the country, but it really was fundamentally saying, well, what are the markets which have got all the fundamentals that I know and that data suggests are going to put them in a better position in 10 years. Now, that's all the basic things of population growth, jobs creation, lack of supply, increase infrastructure, the aspects that come with buying at the right time in the cycle, and then having my finance strategist as well. So it wasn't just me, it was saying, well, I want to buy this, but I want to buy that next. So how do we do this? And not just buying the property blindly, saying, well, let's set this finance up. And I know you guys speak a lot about finance strategy rather than a broker a lot, and that is something that is very akin to us, is it's not just a discussion in isolation about how to buy this property, it's if I buy this property, what's going to happen when I want to put my application for that next property, and so on and so forth. So it was probably a matter of at least half a dozen properties which fit that really understandable, more or less didn't necessitate me to earn the income I was earning to hold these properties. So irrespective of my income, these properties took care of themselves. They increased in value over time. Some could add value couple of granny flats on some of them to increase some yields to allow my cash flows elsewhere. Some of them were subdivisions, which I didn't necessarily execute immediately, and then continued to layer into different markets, and kept my budgets relatively, except for the development I've done now, I kept my spend in a way that wasn't going to be a Hail Mary or a huge expenditure for any one particular property at one particular point in time. So my income didn't dictate the price point I was paying for that next property either.
Yeah, because I mean, you're seeing a game, property's a game of chess / finance,
Yep.
you know, thinking 2 or 3 moves in advance, so more so than bricks and mortar.
So are you finding it now with the tightening in credit that it's going to be a little bit harder? I mean, what's your broker saying, your investment savvy mate saying to you?
Yeah, look, I think it's probably going to be, I most certainly think that the next 2 to 3 years we're going to probably see a necessary restriction in probably people who are on the edge of probably shouldn't really be attaining certain types of finance for risk types of aspects. But I think for me it's going to be much more of the people who should be borrowing are going to borrow. I think it's definitely going to take out some heat from the market, or it already has. I mean, it does, suggesting we're a year into it here in Sydney, we're probably 6 to 8 months into it in Melbourne, and we're probably another year before we find the true bottom in Sydney, and we're probably, as we saw some RP data last week, is that the length and depth of that trough is going to dictate how long it's going to take to get back out of that trough. So we're probably, I personally think we're probably here till 2021, 2022 in Sydney, and probably Melbourne's not necessarily going to be too distant from those numbers, but for me, how that's going to allow for opportunities, I think if you've planned correctly and you've released cash or equity at a time where it was probably a little bit more opportunistic to do so, you're still flush. And there's still ways for people to then say there's going to be growth markets out there. I mean, we were buying in Hobart 3 years ago. We've stopped buying there recently, but there was markets there. There's still going to be the next Hobart market. You know, there's opportunities in regional centres. There's opportunities in which there'll always be opportunities, but I think truly the finance game is going to be a tougher one, which will make sure that people have to be more attuned to their cash flows, because even if they can get the money, being prepared to pay P&I on that money is another aspect which we haven't been really accustomed to for the last 5 years.
Yeah, I think if you look through the murkiness of the credit environment at the moment, it's manufactured, you know, from the regulators to try and sort of, I think their ultimate goal is to say, well, if a household could have 2 or 3 investment properties, we'd be okay with that. We're probably not happy about the fact that everyone wants to go out and buy a dozen.
No,
you know, and that's unsustainable. So I can see the method in their madness around trying to get to that story, and I don't mind that. I mean, ultimately, you know, what we talk about, 120,000, you know, 160 for me is an example. It's like that's 5, 6 good properties. That's it, you know, for me, and I haven't been too hands-on.
Yeah.
So I do still feel that households will have a great opportunity to do that. Of course, the people with the higher incomes, they're going to be in a position where, you know, they're going to have better access to credit. But the ones who don't are going to have to be more inventive around harvesting a granny flat on the back or whatever it is. Because if they're not going to sell them, you know, because sometimes granny flats are great, but I see some of these dual locks and all that types, you know, going up in Queensland, and I sit back and I go, if you ever have to sell one of these, how many people are going to love them if there's heaps of them around?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, which really is, I think, within our industry as buyers agents is a true test to making sure that the cream rises here. And I think we've all got our own mission in place to say that I'm all for people buying property that makes sense. But when people truly don't understand what they're buying and why they're buying it, regardless whether it makes sense or not, that makes me very nervous. And I think that's the key point, is making sure that people buy assets which they understand, and from there they can make sure that they made a clear decision. And if they don't have a clear exit strategy on how you sell a dual key that can't be strated in a market which is full of dual keys which can't be strated, and they're all owned by investors, and that there is a 70% rental ratio, you say, well, how is that going to appreciate value? And even if it does, and you need to get rid of that property at a pinch, how are you going to do that in a soft market?
Yeah. You're going to have to drop your pants.
This is it. And I think most people like to bury their head in this end. In that moment, they say it's never going to happen. This is Australia, property doesn't go backwards. Well, look at every market over any period of time, you'll see that there will be times. And if you aren't prepared for it, this is a challenge ahead for a lot of people. So I don't think it's a status quo. I think it's finding markets that make sense. It's managing your budgets, and it's working with good financiers who aren't just there to write the biggest loan with the biggest commissions to get your money or make the most amount of money out of you. It's to have someone who's going to be a partner for 20 years plus. And ideally, I want to be a client of my broker for another 20 years. I'm not preparing to pay off my properties in 2 weeks. And really, the best brokers or finance strategists are the ones out there who understand that, well, I want this guy, I want this girl for the life of how long they're going to buy property for.
Yeah, I mean, you circle back to those dual keys, and they're building, hundreds of them, right? And people are lapping them up thinking, look at the yield I'm getting in the instant. I'm even seeing people promote them as instant equity that we're making, yet they can't be subdivided. I'm like, this is just wrong, and, be careful. But
fails the owner-occupier test.
It does, but it also, it circles back to, okay, well, there's going to be an oversupply of rental accommodation in the area. So, the purple cow is the freestanding 4-bedroom house next door compared to everyone else. I got a dual key. It's like, well, you're dual key, but I can actually rent. Now there's an oversupply. The person with a 4-bedroom house is going to be able to attract the tenant over everyone else. So now they may not get as high a rent as they wanted, but ultimately, there's always a flight to quality. Whenever a market overshoots itself, the flight to quality always wins. So people say, well, out wide, I can rent closer in and I only pay a certain amount and I'm paying the same amount out wide. And it's like, well, if people had a choice of whether they wanted to live out wide or live closer in, purple cow, flight to quality. I'll come in because I've got the amenity, the living and lifestyle and all the features around that. So it's interesting. I mean, I've been doing this long enough now to sort of be through 2 or 3 cycles.
Yep.
And if it's not the property investment trusts and the little, the tax schemes and then it's the granny. So I've just been through enough cycles to know who is this product positioned for. I want a position for owner occupiers. I want to make sure that it's got demand in any market as best that I can. Because if I'm spending other people's money, it's okay if I want to have a little gamble and
for sure.
go and have a punt in Cable Beach or whatever. But for other people, in terms of I'm not wrecking their lives.
No.
And I do wonder about these people. And in a lot of cases, when you sit down with those professionals, Paul, whether we call them professionals, they don't even know what they're doing. Like you say, do you realise that you can't strata that, and you realise that there's going to be no, my boss didn't tell me that. It's like they're just a sales agent who've been trained to say the right things.
Amateurs.
Yeah, exactly.
So if we circle back to granny flats, do you have any advice for people? Because it's largely a New South Wales thing, because you've got severe restrictions in Victoria. So for the listeners that are outside of New South Wales, what are some of the key things that you'd say that they need to think about if they were considering that? Because you've clearly done it because you want some cash flow, and there is a place if you get the right ones.
Yep.
What are the principles around getting the right ones from your perspective?
Really good question, mate, because I think from my side of things, so many times we get an inquiry, I want to put a granny flat on. Well, that's all good and well, but this is your first investment and you've got aspirations to build to this size portfolio and you're going to go and plough X amount of money into a granny flat straight away. Well, I can tell you right now, if you go do that, you've got no equity or cash left, so you can't build that portfolio there and you're hamstrung. So it happens all the time. I think for me, the biggest advice is, first and foremost, is have a plan and have an understanding of, is this property or is the zoning within the market that you're going to be buying and going to fit what a granny flat can actually firstly be constructed in? Because full stop, understanding your zoning is absolutely vital. New South Wales is a bit easier because it's a blanket state-based zoning. When you go to places like Queensland, you've got local jurisdictions which change everything from side access, rear access, distance from the main house, size of the property, and that all depends on the property type, the zoning of that area. So a lot different kettle of fish. Victoria, as you said, more or less blanket, don't even bother thinking about it. Unless you're going to do one under the table.
If you get one done, because there are a few out there, right? So if you're prepared,
we've done one in Laverton.
Yep, there you go. Yeah. So if you're prepared you're building a moat. And if everyone's going into the north of the city and doing them, and you can get one down south against the grain, then but
this is your space more than mine. But in Victoria, it's got to have a blood link, and if the blood link doesn't exist anymore, there's potentially got to pull it down.
Exactly. And so there's one that we did was already existing. We didn't construct it. It was a house. This was probably coming on 3 years ago now. I can remember it because it's the only one we did. But it was essentially a private rent. So you run your inherent risk with private rents that come with that. And I'm pro property management every day of the week. But that was the only scenario which was in 5-6 minutes to a university site and a couple of minutes from a train station where you could get that private rent via a Gumtree, and the property manager agreed to say they're happy to take it on, etc. So it was one of those very, very unique scenarios. But beyond that, if you start to dabble in it, sure, you might get a few away and get it, essentially pull the wool over council's eyes, but that's your strategy.
You're dancing with the devil, because we get clients ring up, particularly from New South Wales, engage us as a buyer's agent, say, can you get us a granny flat? It's like, well...
They think it's a cakewalk.
Let's just pause on that. Let's just talk about that.
We did get one the other month, but we bought a couple over the journey in Melbourne, but they're pre-existing, right? Like we're not doing the work as
we're not trying to get it on.
We're not trying to get it on. I mean, Perth opened up their bylaws and so forth to try and stimulate a bit of that sort of stuff as well, but problem with Perth is you've just got chronic oversupply.
Exactly.
So why would I rent a granny flat now when I've got 7, 8%, 9% vacancy rates? Flight to quality again. It comes back to the point I was making before.
Football teams, you're talking football teams now, eh? Flight to quality over in Perth.
Sorry, I've got to keep laughing. Yes, true.
No, look, I think, and that's the biggest key, is obviously understanding your zoning, where it can and can't be done is first and foremost. But then from there, and really the litmus test is there a demand for it? And that's the point. Yes, sure. Look, I can show you everywhere and anywhere in New South Wales, Sydney, Central Coast, South Coast, North Coast. So sure, great, put a granny flat on. But right now, I can tell you, if you're in an area that's got a huge amount of supply coming in the rental space, it's redundant. And you have to say, well, who rents a granny flat? Usually there's 2 to 3 different types of tenants. It's going to either be, and I'll generalise, but I'll say it's usually going to be a single mother. It's going to be potentially a young couple with no kids and looking at entry-level rental, or it's going to be a retiree who can't necessarily, or a retiree couple who want to be close to amenity in an established market but can't afford a full house,
and
or
I'll
don't
just
want
throw the
whole
student
thing
in there and and that's it. But you're pretty much done.
Absolutely.
And again, when you come back to selling that asset, you know, there's people like, oh, what are we going to do with that? Like, what are we going to do with that thing on the back of the block? Like, unless we've got a teenage daughter or something who wants a bit of privacy and a bit of space, like straight away you're guessing on your market. You get a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom, open living, deck out the back. Oh, it's going to appeal to most people.
Yeah, and that's really for us, is clients we have who buy property which has the potential for a granny flat, we always reference it as potential, but it's not going to be something you execute immediately. And that's the key, is wait till your portfolio is at a point now where you've got the exposure you need, then you circle back and say, well, let's increase cash flow where and when it makes sense, because that cash, granny flat across the board, the irony is they usually cost the same to build within 5% variance in the middle of Sydney or 45 minutes from the CBD, and your return on that investment is starkly different in each of those markets. So your ROI, you've got to look at it from a cash flow perspective. Is it the right time? But even a 120 grand granny flat, talk about a 30% deposit, we're sort of talking 40 grand cash equity that you're going to have to throw at it. What can that money be reappropriated to do? If you haven't built your portfolio to the degree you want it, that 40 grand leveraged properly is going to do a lot more work for you over the next 15 years. So for us, it's sort of saying it's got to be the right point in time. And if you've got the exposure, great. Now circle back and start thinking about some cash flow that can be generated from that. So I think right time, right place, but right strategy and reasoning. But there's got to be demand. And also people talk about, can I then therefore add value via a granny flat? Well, you know what, truth be told, you will get it valued. And I've had it firsthand where I've built numerous granny flats personally on properties and with intent of saying, I'll get a val and see what happens. And the val comes back unequivocally saying it's current value plus construction costs, there's your value. Rightly so. I haven't really added value other than the fact. No, and if anything, it's
taken away the market.
Taken away a big wedge of the market. You've already probably eradicated 50-60% of the on-sell people who would buy that property down the track. So that's the other part. At a pinch, if you need to get rid of that asset, you better hope it's red hot, because otherwise investors won't be, well, investors are the only people who'll be over buying that asset.
So it's the wrong question to say, should I have a granny flat? It's a better question to say, what does my strategy need to see if the granny flat forms part of that from your view?
Exactly.
Now, you get involved in property development. Where did that start? Did it start from an overflow of your own experience? And what do clients come to you looking for?
Yeah, so for where it started for me personally is it started for a desire to try and figure out ways to create equity beyond organic growth, and probably doing it a little bit of hand in glove in buying markets which I saw at the time were going to grow, and reinvesting into a property that we saw growth coming, and then secondly, a property which we understood could be manufactured via, for me personally speaking, it started graduating with things like granny flats renovations, and I've done my fair share of both of those. Graduating to blocks, the first one I did personally was a corner block subdivision, keeping the front house, subdividing, building a second house. I still own both of those properties, but it was sort of to understand how to make these things work, not just on an ROI, on a 20% margin as a baseline, but then how do I cash flow it? And that first one that I did, I can reflect back, was in west of Brisbane. It was a corner block. It had a house that I knew based on my survey could be retained, but also had a tenant in place on purchase, kept the tenant through the whole development. I dialed down their rent a little bit, but understood there's ways to do this that not just say, okay, I'll make my 20% at the end, but how do I retain cash flow throughout that whole process? So it was a necessity for me to say, I want to give this a bit of a supercharge, and I've started that years and years ago now, but I wanted to graduate myself, and that's something I'm a big proponent in, is that if I'm not prepared to do it, I wouldn't be recommending any of our clients to do something that there may be ways to do stuff that there is most certainly ways to do things that I don't know about, but if I don't know it, I can't recommend it. Yeah. And so it was a way for me to say, well, if I'm going to be the one sitting at the front end saying I want to get development sites for my clients, I need to have proof in the pudding. So since then, we've bought umpteenth properties which are predominantly 1 into 2 or 1 into 3 style subdivisions, be it battle axe or what they deem to be hatchet blocks in certain markets, but also looking at properties which, based on zoning changes that have happened within markets, buying properties that are still a buy and hold land bank, but then saying, well, this is a much higher density opportunity. So it's a cash flow opportunity to say it's relatively cash flow neutral, but it's also going to allow you down the track to say, you know what, this block of land based on current zoning restrictions might yield 8, 10, 15 units, or we might even buy the side-by-side scenario, which we've done probably 6 times in the last 2 years, where we create much bigger opportunities that can happen down the track. So for us...
Oh, sorry, mate. I just got to laugh because he's going to get absolutely nailed when the stick...
He wasn't in the trough.
...realises that there's a waterfall in our recording. Because I get hammered so much, and then Ben rarely pours the water, and then it sounds like it's Niagara Falls.
Sorry about that, everyone.
So...
No, look, valid. I was distracting for me too.
I'm trying to make it pour like it's not making a noise. I'm like, no.
But so it sort of graduated from there, and we have a big focus. So my team of buyers agents, really, we have a big focus on absolutely, even if we're just buy and hold strategy, understanding our zoning in and out to say, if we look at a property, because a lot of the time this is where sales agents, I think, do a disservice to their vendors, is they a lot of the time don't know what a property can have done to it. Mm-hmm. And our job is really to be on the other side saying, well, we know what can happen there. I'm not going to tell you what can happen there, but we know that you are underselling this property. We'll grab it. Thank you very much. So really for us, it's an upskill and it's a value add to make sure that our clients get an absolutely gem of an outcome. And having town planners you can pick up the phone to and give you the right advice is the other aspect. So that sort of graduated me to buying those types of assets, both for myself, developing myself, and for our clients. Our BAs all invest in these markets as well, so they've got most certainly vetted interest in saying, I want to know what's going on because my money's in these markets too. And I've recently probably taken on my biggest development, which I documented, I think it was back in November last year, where I full well knew that the Sydney market was cooked, so to speak, but we were looking at an opportunity to buy our own or occupy, but I've resisted. I've rent vested for the best part of 8 years of my life and 2 young kids, and we're comfortable with it. It's fine. We would have kept doing it if we didn't see this opportunity come up. But it was a way to say, well, you know what? There's a way now for us to live exactly where we want to live. This is almost exactly the street and the area that we wanted to be within, and the school catchments, all the rest of it. But then from there we saw, you know what? We've got our opportunity here. This is a way to, again, classic off-market, much more expensive than what I would be buying for my own investment. But the ROI was 23, 24% on it, and we were factoring a 10% decline in the market in November. A 7-month settlement, which I've literally just driven past the site on the way here, is now a levelled site, and we're going to be running services next week. So for me, it's really trying to make sure that that's the next level of, and I want to have fully indebted experience in what I do and what I talk about, and I'm documenting that warts and all, so people can get a really clear understanding of how, what, why, and things that we won't do either. But I've partnered up with I'm JVing on that with a town planner and architect who are fully invested in it, as well as my town planner and architect on the project. So it's about surrounding yourself with just the people are far smarter than I am. Yeah. And I think that's really what I do really well personally. If I was to say, someone asked me what I do really well, is surround myself with people I know are so much better.
So is it a 3-sider, 4-sider?
So it's going to be 4 separate properties. So it was one big block, which essentially was 2 properties or 2 titles amalgamated into one, demolishing, splitting it back out into 2, but then building 2 separate luxury duplexes, 4 pools, 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms in each, 2 living areas, the whole 9 yards of everything they go with, and a hell of a lot of debt that comes with that as well.
And what sort of land size were you?
It was 1,200 square metres when we bought it, so they'll be split out to 4 Torrens titled 300 square metre blocks, effectively.
So tight blocks, but
tight blocks, but you know, a couple of streets back from the beach,
perfect.
300 metres from a train station, all the stuff you say, like it's
lock and load.
It's. I mean, you look at it from a life perspective, and the irony is that it's next door to my son's daycare, and it's 300 metres from my sons and daughters' primary school and 300 metres from there where their high school will be. So it's one of those things where it's perfect. But I look at it and say, you know what, bugger it, I put so much blood, sweat and tears to get to this. And so did my wife for that matter, and I can say that she's a bit of a benign passenger, but she's been driving this as much as I have. She's just been in the background. But it's really, this is a great graduation for me to say, you know what, I fully am understanding that this is not a great market, and if anyone wanted to go and do this right now, just understand your onions, because if you don't, this is a way that people could go broke really, really quick. But then speaking about finance, geez, this took 6 months to finance this deal, and I got a 7-month settlement thinking I was home and hosed. So we had DA lodge within four weeks of settling this property, because my JV partners are geniuses. But it took us 6 months, and as someone who I released all my equity before I even signed papers to make sure I had cash on hand for deposits, I had everything lined up, and it ended up being, it was very close to a private money scenario where I had tons of equity and tons of cash released, and then we're talking 9% interest rates. Thankfully, we ended up working with some really smart guys and got a 4.5% NAB loan for main tier, where I was like, wow, it took a long time to figure it out though. But now this is a difference of, on our finance, it's a difference of 200 grand in finance, and you do your math very quickly there. People are like, wow, that's baffling. Profit's gone. And
well, there it is. There's your 24 goes down to what, 14, 15 real quick, and if you've got a sluggish sale, you're down to 8s, and it's not worth your effort. You
no, and then say, like, I would have preferred to just offset my portfolio. But again, it's coming down to who you know, surrounding yourself with people who can just get things done. That if I was to go on retail to figure out different ways of doing that, I've got no chance. And this is a big part of what we do as a community, is we just want to surround people with people who know what they're doing in their particular specificity far better than what they could otherwise do and what they do for a vocation.
How did you navigate the finance waters in your own portfolio when you were starting the business, when the banks...
Good question, mate. I spent a year, I truly spent a year planning my exit from my job. And there's going to be a few of, no doubt, my employees who are going to listen to this and they're going to think, you scheming bastard. But look, I was pretty transparent. People knew I was a property investor when I was doing what I was doing in a corporate environment. But I literally spent a year trying to figure out, I was doing a development, the first development I was at the time, and I intentionally wanted to get that finished because I wanted to make sure that was financed. I wanted to release the equity on a reval, which I did, and I went wholesale and revaled everything before I even murmured a word about trying to figure out how to exit my job. So once that was ticked and I knew the money was in the bank and I could see it, then I thought to myself, okay, comfort level's here now. I was going to take a hiatus for a year minimum when I was starting my business. That ended up being about 6 months because I just saw an opportunity that came up, which I grabbed immediately. And I'm quite gung-ho with that. And as you no doubt know, real opportunities don't present themselves for very long. If they're there, they're an opportunity. And I was still in a portfolio build scenario, but it really was a year of making sure if I'm going to leave at this stage and I want to finance this build, I can't leave then. If I want to do these other things in the next 2 or 3 years, because you're going to need minimum 1 year trading, but typically 2 years trading as well, as saying, well, I've got to have cash ready to go. I want to have my refis ready to go, and then I want to be really attractive. I don't want to spend that money just yet, but I want to make sure that money's available because they'll say no the moment I walk away and I don't show income. So
I was the same. I came out of my corporate and had all the equity, released, sitting out there for the first 3 years in business. I made a loss in the first year and the second, but I wasn't paying myself.
No.
So for 3 years there was absolutely very little in terms of coming from the business, in terms of what that looks like. But that's a different story, isn't it? I mean, ultimately we've created a passion job. We love what we do. All of us sitting here, and that's the story you go on. I could have comfortably stayed in the corporate space and probably lasted another 10 or 15 years and I would have been done, but I would have had the portfolio and I would have had everything sorted out. So it's you know, the fruits of our labour come later on in terms of the business, but the passive investments are sat there and they're doing their things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a couple final ones for me, Ben. In terms of books that your go-to books that if someone says, what's a book I should read, what do you recommend? And you've talked earlier on the podcast about your mentors. Have you got virtual mentors?
Yeah, good question. You know what? I have, and I think I said this earlier, I have an absolute mind like a sieve. For certain points in life, I'm sharp as a tack, and there's certain times where most of it's short-term memory are absolutely terrible. But books-wise, you know what, as much as and I don't want to spruik the guy because I know he's doing very well in his book sales anyway, but and I definitely don't agree with everything that goes there, but Barefoot Investor for me was not necessarily someone I thought, wow, he's my go-to, but I looked at that and I thought, well, there's a way for someone to explain something so simply without getting too complicated with it. Now, to a degree, it probably fluffs up a market which is a lot more complex than what it actually is. But if I was to indulge you both, I think your book, your first book, that I've read and some of my team members have read as well, I think that it gives some people, and this is my biggest gripe, is I think people don't truly understand where that education needs to sit, and just understanding money management, as boring as it can be, the more interesting and real life we can provide that. And I think you're essentially your armchair investor scenario where it was really trying to think about how that can allow people to just understand their money management a bit better, and different books that sit around there. But that's probably for me what I do personally. But it's funny because I don't budget, and I never have budgeted, and I'm not anti-budgeting, but I know for me budgeting doesn't work. But there are some people who fundamentally should be budgeting all the time, every time. And I think you guys do a fantastic job in trying to make sure that people understand that, is that it's a habitual process, and unless you understand those habits and you're aware of them, you'll never change them. And I think that's really the awareness that we all need to understand, is if you don't know your numbers, no one will know your numbers.
Well, it's funny you say that. We're writing a book currently now that we're trying to get to the publisher, Ben, about the very premise that budgets don't work. And
the reason
I'm glad you said don't work.
Budgets don't work on their own in isolation. They just don't.
Well, we're trying to make it simple too.
Yes,
because there is subtle complexities and subtle variations that take you down to different rabbit warrens. So that's
not to be confused with the fact that you should still have a budget in our view, because you need to have some boundaries. But on their own, it's like driving with the windscreen fully blacked out, looking in the rear vision mirror. They need support. They need a rules-based system that makes them happen on the slipstream rather than sort of grind and get to the end of the month, pulling it out of the drawer going, oof, and have $1,000 left over and there's only $20.
We sampled our staff to see who was using the Money Smart site, and pretty much everyone's using it. But they're all using slight variations to a theme, right? So when you're writing a book, it's like, okay, you know, what was those books where you could choose your own adventures?
Yeah.
And sort of, like which page do you go? So it's a bit like, how do we herd those cats into the rules-based system? Because I get annoyed.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, that's the rule.
Yeah.
This is the way it works. If you deviate from that, you open yourself up for a bit more risk in terms of doing that.
Yep.
So I'm sort of trying to keep it to one choose your own, one adventure. You can't go off on different adventures, because if you start doing a few of those other things, that's where you go wrong. It's the behavioural thing. See, because we're not trying to change cash flow, we're actually trying to change behaviour. And so the 7-day float, which we call our living and lifestyle, right? That's the most important thing. That if you've said,
if your 7-day float's $2,000, knock yourself out.
Seriously,
it's $400. But once you've determined what it is,
there's
Ben says the best,
consequences.
swim between the flags.
I love it. And it's funny you say about books. I've spent the last, 9 months trying to write this book of mine, and really it's all about my fundamentally focusing on how to set your barometer. And that's really the theme about what I'm trying to communicate to people is, look, I can talk till I'm blue in the face about property and about where and how and strategy and property types and how it fits cash flows, etc. I can do that really well. But the thing that I think we don't do at all, more in the early years, and also I think as parents we don't do well enough with our kids, is how to set principles, how to make sure people understand what is your expectation, what's your number. Don't just pluck it out of the air. Find out why that number's your number and how much do you need to truly be healthy and happy. Like going back to my early 20s, your early 20s, everyone's early 20s or late teens, or at some stage in your life where you found an opportunity to say, you know what, I love where I am right now. I may not have much money, but the experience and the smile on my face says it all. Is that how do you crystallize that into a number? Because fundamentally, that's all we need. And really, that's what I'm trying to convey in what we say, is that everyone's different. Some people want that Lamborghini, and that is going to be their motivation. And fine, I'm not here to say change that, but
Majority don't.
Majority don't. No. Vast majority don't. And going back to the billionaire who you give a call, probably has that Lamborghini, are they any happier than when they were worth $5 million? No. Absolutely.
Go and hire it.
Seriously.
Hire it for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
You'll
realise you don't want it.
Yep.
Jerry Harvey says if you have 10 million or you're a billionaire, your choices are pretty much the same.
Yeah.
So, but your time freedoms aren't.
Absolutely.
I mean, the thing I love in Scott's book is the stuff around teaching kids the value of money.
Massively.
There's some really good gold in that piece. I quite enjoyed that. I circled back to that the second time around because we're fortunate enough to have nice things and a few, successful. But the reality is our children have got abundance of things, and it does worry me that they just think that money grows on trees, right? And they can go to an ATM and you can just keep pulling it out and going out for dinner once a week.
We're children of the 70s. It drives us nuts.
Yeah, it does drive us a little bit crazy. So this value of money and to work for it, like teach a kid how to fish as opposed to, basically giving fish for food every night doesn't make sense to me.
Agreed.
Hey, one thing that's been really clear in this chat, Ben, is I've had a couple of chats with Paul over the phone. You've had more experience face to face, but you can just tell a couple of things. He's passionate, he's authentic, but he actually cares about the outcomes of his family, but also for his clients as well. And I think it's hopefully it comes across when the listeners are listening to this, because he's a quality individual. He's got quality information, and he's based here in Sydney. He's got a business called Pure Property Investment. We'll put some details in the show notes if you want to reach out to Paul, say good day, pick his brain, have a chat to him, see if there's something that might resonate with you. But
appreciate it,
mate. We appreciate you coming on. We appreciate you sharing your insights, and mate, it's been terrific for us. But
yes, thanks, mate.
Before we sign off, question without notice, life hack.
Life hack. Question without notice, life hack.
If it's no, it's fine.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. It's a no.
Okay, cool. So
I was thinking something, but I was like, that's a bit rude. That's not going to work at all.
That was really unfair, because I should have done it before we hit record, but I've got one. I just wanted to make sure you didn't have one. So Ben, my life hack today is, and it actually happened in this meeting,
with the phone,
with your phone, because the old measure twice, cut once. We always do a backup of our recording on an iPhone. Now,
or a Samsung.
It started on a Samsung, back on an iPhone.
Nokia.
I don't know. Do you have an iPhone?
I do.
Yeah. So do you have the setting where you go in there, and if there's a text message or if there's an alarm, it starts flashing the LED light at the back without necessarily the noise?
Yep.
That's my life hack today, because sometimes you don't. You've got to have it on silent, but it's in the background, it's flashing. So for me, I've had it on for a long time, and when I was thinking about today's life hack, I thought, have I told that? But B, it's actually been great to get visual alerts around certain things that happen on your phone, particularly if you're in a meeting and you don't want everyone to hear. At least you're stimulated visually. So you go into the settings, go to General, go to Accessibility, and then click on LED flash for alerts, Ben. So that's my life hack. And we were recording, and you've got a text message
coming out, tick, tick,
and the place is lighting up like a strobe factory. So there you go. Did you know?
Did you know, Bryce? So our good friends at CoreLogic got some data around the amount of transactions. I'm going to just do percentages. But we talked about winter was coming, about 18 months ago, and then 12 months, and now finally winter's here, and we talked about supply increases. Mm-hmm. This is what happens as part of the cycle. Mm-hmm. So I just want to share with everyone, nationally, we're 8.8% down on sale transactions year on year to the end of June. Regionally, it's flat. So it hasn't happened so much. Capital cities and our fringes, we're down 11.2%. So around the grounds, Canberra, in terms of number of sales this year compared to last year in terms of transactions, down 11.5%, Darwin down 6.9%, Hobart down 9.6%, so still cooling off. Perth down 0.4%, so you can see it's finally coming to the skids. Scraping for a landing. Adelaide, our little quiet achiever in Adelaide, ticking over, positive 1%.
Yep.
So 1% more sales this year on year than the previous year. Brisbane's down 12.8%, Melbourne's down 14.4%, and Sydney, rounding out the big guns, down 14.3%. So there is your stock story in terms of extra stock on market. So the bonuses for the real estate agents this year are going to be a little bit smaller than they were in the last couple of years in our big capital cities.
Are you getting more calls from agents than
Especially in Hobart. Since we stopped buying in there, I tell you what, I didn't get a call for 6 months, and we hassle people left, right, and centre. But these days, I tell you what, there's more calls.
Isn't it interesting? Because by nature, the type of you're a borderless. You go where the market's running, so it's pretty rare to have the agents ring you more than not when you're in the markets you want to be in.
Exactly.
So it's funny to have the shoe on.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah.
Hey, before we officially sign off, AFL footy team, or you're just NRL?
Mate, I'm a Swans supporter. I wouldn't say I'm through and through. I know a little bit about the history, and I definitely follow it. But I'm a fair weather supporter at best.
NRL team?
I'm a Westie born and bred, so I was a Western Suburbs person when they amalgamated with Balmain Tigers. So I'm a West Tigers boy. I live in Cronulla, so it creates all kind of issues with
Sharks,
with my son, who has nothing but friends who go for the Sharks, and my son will go for the Tigers. It's already creating issues in our family.
Like my boys, no choice Pies supporters.
No choice.
You don't get a choice for that.
Well, it worked when they were two, mate. They had no teeth back then, but they've grown since then. But again, mate, thanks for your time.
You're welcome.
Thanks for coming to the airport in our sort of mobile studio here. But good luck, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Appreciate it.
Till next time, Ben.
Knowledge is empowering, Bryce, but only if you act on it.
See you next week.